All right, so we've gone live now. We'll give it just a second for some folks who meet with us pretty much every week. Yeah.
When you're watching this, we can't hear what people are asking or saying after.
Sometimes I try to rework the question as I answer it, but that's sometimes a little more than, I don't want it to be too awkward. So yeah, sometimes it's not there. Not a whole lot I can, other than, there's been a couple of times I've thought about putting the camera or something midway back in the room. But anyway, we've got a few people joining us. Welcome. Glad y'all could make it. We got 6 folks live right now. Hi, Katie. There you are again. Katie is, next to my mom, Katie is the most faithful one to join us. She's here every week, so we'll have to get her back in the room one of these days. There's Aunt Jetta, and there's my mama. So we got 5 people live with us today, so we're going to get going. This week, as you know, we have talked about the idea of reading. I've been reading things online. I spend a lot of time on Facebook, not for the purpose of making status updates or for killing time or whatever we use Facebook for. I peruse the news feeds because I'm looking for articles and different things out there that we can discuss. And I didn't really find one this week that I wanted to jump into, but I received an email from a young lady in one of our other classes who is talking to another lady. And anyway, in the blog that she sent me, there was the discussion of the idea that it is God's desire for us to be happy, that it is God's plan for us to be happy. And though I agree that God is not going to his goal is not to make us unhappy, but the fact that he can use unhappy circumstances and trials to grow us, to make us more like him, that is not his ultimate goal, I don't believe, is for you to be happy, for me to be happy. I think his ultimate goal is for us to be holy. And therefore, that got me thinking, and some of the verses that this young lady was using for her defense of that idea were the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5. And that got me looking at the Beatitudes and different things. And so I decided in that process that, hey, why not have a quick little 3-week series on the Beatitudes? So that's where we're going to start today. The Beatitudes, like I said, are in Matthew chapter 5. This is the beginning of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. I could tell a really bad joke now and tell us this is proof that there was baseball in the Bible because they had a Sermon on the Mound. But it's a bad joke, so I'm not going to tell it. But it's Matthew chapter 5. As Matthew chapter 4 ends, we are learning that Jesus has called a few disciples. His disciples were willing to leave everything they knew. They left their livelihood. They left their family. They gave it all up in order to follow him. He asks for similar sacrifice from us. When we determine that we are going to be a follower of Christ, when we decide that we are going to ask him to forgive us of our sins and take up our cross and follow him, he asks us for similar sacrifice, to give up the things that sometimes we're most comfortable with. Sometimes it's the things that though it's a comfort spot for us, it can actually draw us away from him. And he asks us to remove those things and follow him cleanly. Toward the end of very end of the chapter, Jesus greets many great crowds, and he then also heals people. He heals all kinds of afflictions and diseases. He then also will move on into Jerusalem and so forth and all around Galilee. So we begin chapter 5, and it tells us in Matthew 5, verse 1, seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, and then it begins what Jesus had to say. Now, Matthew is not simply being detailed as he writes this out. He's not just giving us subtle or insignificant details when he tells us that Jesus sat down to teach. In his culture, those who had authority sat. They didn't stand behind a podium. They didn't get up on a stage. They sat, and those who were there to hear them would gather around. Paul tells us that he learned for years at the feet of Gamaliel, or however you say his name. Okay, the idea that he learned at his feet was again the idea that he was sitting doing his teaching, and the people were gathered around to listen. So Jesus is making a statement when he sits down to teach. He's not a leader of a synagogue. He's not a leader of the temple. He's not a Levite or a priest, but he is the one with all authority. And he sits to teach the people who are listening. Also, who does it say he's teaching? His disciples. Now, the crowds gathered round him. The crowds were there to hear him, and his popularity brought them out. Maybe we could consider these crowds as maybe some just interested folk. Maybe they were just some folks who, as in today's culture of doing evangelism and so forth, we might call them seekers. They're wanting to hear what Jesus has to say, but it's his popularity, it's the things he's done that's got their attention. It's not who he is or the things he has said as of yet. He has healed people. He has done some things. He's done some miracles that's got their attention, and they're coming around him. But notice that Matthew makes it very clear, who is Jesus teaching? He's teaching his disciples. Now, throughout the book of Matthew, he often uses the word disciple to speak directly of the 12, the apostles. They are gathered there with him as well. But it really, Matthew also uses the word to distinguish between those who are simply following him out of popularity versus following them who want to follow him, who want to learn from him. So Jesus is speaking directly to those who have a desire to learn from him. Sometimes we get a little bent out of shape and stress too hard on trying to make sure that our lessons and our sermons and the things we teach are able to hit a broad audience. When every once in a while, if not most of the time, we might ought to be focusing in on those who are truly following him to work on discipling them a little more rather than trying to hit such a broad range. That's just my own 2 cents. Okay? I don't have anything to back that up other than Jesus taught his disciples. Okay? So that's what he says. So we're getting into it. As we get ready to start verse 3, my question for you is what do you think of? When I say to you, we're going to have a quick 3 or 4 week series on the Beatitudes. When you hear Beatitudes, does anything come to mind? Some would say no. Some who have grown up in church, maybe went to VBS when they were kids. When you hear the word Beatitudes, maybe a thought or a word or two come to mind. Any ideas on that? Blessed. And this is the only place I know of that we, other than singing in hymns, where we have to have enough syllables to make the rhythm work, do we use the word blessed rather than blessed, right? It all depends on which syllable you put your accent, but it's instead of blessed, we would normally in our conversation say, I'm very blessed. We don't generally say, I'm very blessed. Or when we do use blessed, it's usually blessed be, or that kind of thing. But you're right, blessed is usually the word that comes to mind. And that is how I ended up here, because the word blessed is the Greek word makarios, and this is often translated as happy. Makarios being a word that when you look it up in the Bible dictionary or if you look it up in a concordance, there are a few possible meanings for the word, and depending on the context is which word or which way it gets translated. We need to trust our Bible interpreters that they are going to use the best word for the context, but it doesn't always mean the words are interchangeable. Okay? Just because the word can mean happy doesn't mean that you can use happy in its place. I've often heard, maybe you have too, I've heard people put happy in the place here and say, happy are those who. Well, the second beatitude is happy are those who mourn. And that seems like an oxymoron to me. Yeah. Okay? So it didn't seem to fit with me. But this is where the lady on the blog was coming from when she was using the translation of the word and using happy in its place rather than blessed. Blessed and happy are not necessarily the same things. Now, our God blesses us, and generally speaking, those who are blessed are happy people, right? Even in rough circumstances, we have joy. But we can use these circumstances that God can use them to grow us and to make us more like Him. And so sometimes we're not exactly the happiest people, but we can still have joy. But being blessed does not always mean and cannot always be just counteracted there or counter-swapped and make it happy. What does blessed mean? Is this a word that we use often that we just kind of understand it, but we don't really know the definition of it? If I was to ask you, how would you define blessed without looking in your notes that your Bible has written there, and without looking it up on Google, just sitting here today in this room, how would you define blessed? And those of you on there should answer it as well.
An inner peace.
An inner peace, okay. Anybody else?
God's favor.
God's favor. Did you look that up? Okay, good. Okay, anybody else?
No.
No. Okay, anybody else? Okay, well, Kelly's kind of right. Go figure. God's favor. Yeah, go figure. But the truth is that in Scripture we will hear that God blesses people, but people will also turn around and bless God. And it's really a condescending thing for us to bless God, and that's not how we're supposed to be. So when you read that someone in the Bible is blessing God, they are really praising Him. That's what that would come out to be. Well, anytime God blesses us, it really is what did I just say a minute ago? Condescending. Thank you. Because that's the nature of the relationship. He is so much greater, and it's appropriate. But truly, when we find out that we are blessed by God, what it means in general and basically it means that we are fortunate and well off. There's a state of well-being that is due to our relationship with God, and that is primary. If without the relationship to God, then the blessings are not truly what we think they are. Ultimately, blessed carries a sense of being approved by God. And what greater blessing is there than to have God's approval on your life? So Jesus, beginning His Sermon on the Mount, if you could, it has been said, if you can become an expert in living a Christian life, you can do it by living the life that is described in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus it's a very short, you could probably sit and read it in 20 minutes. So it's not a very long sermon. And, of course, Matthew may not have written everything down Jesus said, but he's not a court transcriber or anything. But it's a short sermon. But it is basically, in a nutshell, how to live a Christian life. The goal of living a Christian life is what? What is your goal for living a Christian life?
Shine a light on Jesus.
To shine a light, show Jesus to the world, okay? Share Jesus, okay? Honor to God, bring honor. Bring others to Him, to know Him better. What's our ultimate destination? Heaven, okay? It's interesting, our very first beatitude here, Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." If you drop down to verse 9, the last beatitude is the same. It gives the same result. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Okay, there's actually a blessed in verse 10 as well, but it's a little bit different. So basically, what Jesus is starting off with, he is using a stylistic approach to bracket everything he's about to say here about being able to receive the kingdom of heaven. So even though, for example, verse 4 says they will be comforted, just a general rule is that because of the way he's bracketed it, also they are going to receive the kingdom of heaven. So all of these things are going to lean toward people being able to receive the kingdom of heaven. So he says right off the bat, blessed are the poor in spirit. Is this a financial poor?
No, it's a humble.
Okay, it's humble. I heard another no. Any other answers other than humble?
Like who sees yourself as kind of being empty before God.
Seeing yourself empty before God. Very good. Okay?
Those who know they don't have it together.
Come on.
You realize, Lord, I have a long way to go.
I have a long way to go. I don't have it together. Well, you all have evidently grown up in good Sunday school and life groups, because you have pretty well nailed what this is saying. Okay, the poverty in spirit here is linked to a usage of the Hebrew form of this in the Old Testament. Another way of expressing the meaning is words like lowly and humble. Okay, Proverbs chapter 16 verse 19. If you want to write that down, Proverbs 16:19 says, "It is better to be of a lowly spirit with the poor than to divide the spoil with the proud." Better to be of a lowly spirit with the poor than to divide the spoil with the proud. The prophet Isaiah tells us in Isaiah 57 in verse 15, he tells us, "For thus says the one who is high and lifted up, who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy." Okay, so listen to that description. "For thus says the one who is high and lifted up, who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy." Here's what he says: "I dwell in the high and holy place, and also with him who is of a contrite and lowly spirit, to revive the spirit of the lowly, and to revive the heart of the contrite." Again, Isaiah in chapter 66 verse 2 says, "And these things my hand has made, and so all these things came to me, declares the Lord. But this is the one to whom I will look, he who is humble and contrite in spirit, and trembles at my word." So what is humble? What is lowly in spirit? What is Matthew is quoting Jesus here? What is he saying when he says that approved by God are the poor in spirit? How would you surmise that? Or summarize that?
Those that rely on God instead of themselves.
Those who rely on God. So basically what we're saying, it is a personal acknowledgement of being spiritually bankrupt. A personal acknowledgement. An individual recognizing as an individual that you are spiritually bankrupt. I've been watching too much Big Bang Theory. Bowie has this, So it's poverty in spirit is the personal acknowledgement of being spiritually bankrupt. It's a keen awareness of having a need for God's help. You can't do it on your own. So right off the bat, Jesus is saying, you want to inherit the kingdom of heaven? You have to recognize it's not about you, it's about Him. That's the key in. That's the key factor. There must be a relationship, and in that relationship, you have to recognize He's the boss and not you. You have to be approved by God are those who understand that they have no moral virtues that would commend them to God. There's nothing you have to offer Him. You have to be willing to say, I have nothing to offer you. That is someone who is humble in spirit. Humble isn't the idea of thinking less of yourself. It's been said humble is thinking of yourself less. Okay? You're thinking of yourself less. Another verse where humble comes up that we often quote is 2 Chronicles 7:14. 2 Chronicles 7:14 states, if my people who are called by my name will do what? Humble themselves and pray. Right? If they will humble themselves. The idea of humble is the idea that you are willing to look at God, you are willing to address God and say, you are absolutely right in the way that you judge me. Whatever you say I deserve, whatever you say is my punishment or my blessing, you are absolutely right. I agree with you that what you said is right. So bring that into the life when it's time to follow Christ. You were saying to God, to become a follower of Jesus, you have to humble yourself and say to him, you are absolutely right. What you say is sin is sin.
What's the word punishment? You said punishment. You said punishment. Explain that.
Even as followers, okay, the question is, what is punishment for a Christian? Even as a follower of Christ, he chastens us when we are guilty of sin if we haven't repented of it. You ever had your spiritual spanking? You ever had God clear them bet loops just because you have been unfaithful and you haven't done it right? Sometimes God puts... Sometimes it's poor decisions we make that puts us into a mess. And with those poor decisions comes consequences. And some of those consequences is Jesus chastening us, punishing us. The better word there is probably discipline. Okay? But if you're a non-believer, that when you're coming to Christ, you can say that the punishment is the right word. Because until you come to Christ, you're acknowledging, listen, if you condemn me to hell, you are right to do so. That is humbling yourself before God. It is no longer about self-serving yourself and finding a way to push your own interests. You are now saying, it's not about me, it's about you. That's being a person poor in spirit. That's being a person who is lowly and humble. It's not a false humility. Remember the old story of the guy who received the award for being the most humble person in town? And then a week later they had to take it back because he wore his award everywhere? Okay? So it's not a false, I don't deserve it. We don't deserve it. Okay? But at the same time, it's being able to look at him and saying, you're right in what you're saying. Whatever you say, I will do because you are right. You are just. You are fair. That is the idea of being poor in spirit. Right at the very beginning of this sermon, Jesus is setting the stage, telling us that we cannot fulfill God's standards. Remember, I just told you, he's getting ready to lay out what the Christian life should look like. If you're going to follow me, this is what your life should look like. And he tells us right from the beginning that we can't fulfill those standards. To be humble is to recognize the fact that you can't. D.A. Carson puts it this way: we must come to him and acknowledge our spiritual bankruptcy, emptying ourselves of our self-righteousness, moral self-esteem, and personal vainglory. So some of y'all hit his definition right off the bat with what you said, how you understood it to mean. And D.A. Carson says it's the same thing. We need to acknowledge that we're spiritually bankrupt. That can lead to a feeling of despair sometimes. When you come to recognize the fact that you have nothing to offer, if you dwell on that, it can leave you feeling frustrated. That's a good word. Whoever said that in that area. Frustrated is a good word. Depressed is a good word. Down in the mouth about it. And it's interesting that Jesus turns right around after he's told you need to be humble. You need to understand and recognize that you're spiritually bankrupt. He follows it up with, however, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are those who mourn. What does it mean to mourn? If I told you, if I just said, give me a definition of mourning, not AM in the day, okay, mourning, give me a definition of that. Brokenhearted, deep sadness, grieving a loss, okay? It took me a while to realize that grief is not saved only for when we're losing a loved one. Grief, in its purest definition, is mourning a loss, period. In the year 04 to 05, I came to realize later that I spent that year basically grieving and didn't recognize it. Sometimes we don't We don't consider that we need to grieve when something, anything that is dear to us. It could be a loved one. It could be a job. It could be friendships. It could be, you name it. Any kind of loss can bring about grief. I was on an emotional roller coaster that year. In February of 2004, my best friend died. Andy, and that's who Andrew's named after. He dies in February, and I plummet. Problem is, I didn't grieve. I was a student pastor, and he was very active as a high school teacher and my right-hand man in the ministry. And like other occasions, when we had loss in our ministry, I ended up focusing so much on the students that I didn't take care of the grief myself. So I plummeted down into an abyss of loss in February. And then in April, my emotional roller coaster heads back up because Andrew was born. And that'll get your blood pumping, won't it? Have your child born and so on. And, we named him after Andy because of his relationship with us. And then in May, the class of 2004 graduates, which had been the 7th grade class. They were 7th graders when I started. I'd seen them through. And it was a mass exodus. For a small youth group of 50 to 60, when you lose 15, that's a pretty big loss. And I was really close to them. They were like kids of mine. And so that was a loss that I didn't recognize that I needed to grieve. And I pushed it all away. And maybe some of you are like that. You push things away and you push things down. And before you know it, you're like I was, a raw nerve. And every little thing then sets you off. So for the next year, testimony comes back later that I had changed. And my personality was different. And this, that, and the other. And of course, I finally come back to the conclusion of realizing why that happened as I studied grief later. And my first thought was, well, why didn't anybody tell me? If you have a dear friend or someone you're close to and you see a sudden change in them or it's happened over time, and why don't y'all sit down and talk about it? Rather than, just assuming that he's now turned into this bear of a person and, whatever. Grief. Grief is the loss, the mourning of something that you have lost. The mourning of something that is negative in your life. Here, blessed are those who mourn. Approved by God are those who mourn. Isn't talking about spirit or physical death. Here we're talking about someone approved by God mourns over their own personal sin. As we recognize the blackness of the sin in our lives, it brings us into a moment of grief. Okay? There's a constant battle going on between our natural fleshly appetites and the Holy Spirit of God that lives within us. And it's a battle, and it rages. And it can leave you feeling overwhelmed at times and out of shape at times and short with people at times because you are dealing with something going on that's got you out of balance. When what we need to be doing is grieving it, mourning over that. We need to recognize it for what it is. To be able to approach God as a person who is humble before Him, part of that humility comes from recognizing the blackness of our sin in our own lives. Yes, we are holy, we are and we are redeemed under His blood. But what does that mean? Well, to be redeemed means you had something to be redeemed from. And you have to recognize that even as a follower of Christ, there are going to be times in your life that you come face to face with your own personal sin. And if you don't deal with it, if you don't grieve it, it will come back and bite you. Isaiah found this to happen in his life. When you read Isaiah chapter 6, the prophet it's when he has his vision of going into the temple and the throne room of God, remember? And he saw God high and lifted up, and it was the year that King Uzziah died, and God's train filled the temple, and there were creatures around the throne, right? The seraphims, and they had the 6 wings, and with 2 they covered their mouth, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. Remember the story? Remember that out of Isaiah chapter 6? What happens to Isaiah when he comes face to face with the holiness of God? Woe is me, I'm a man of unclean lips and from a people of unclean lips. He recognizes his own sin before the holy God, because that is our only standard that really matters. It doesn't matter what your family and friends say is sin. It doesn't matter what some blog on the internet that is just someone's opinion says about sin. It matters what Jesus Christ, God the Father, says about sin. And Isaiah came face to face with it. And what represented his sin there that day was his lips, right? Because that's what he said, I'm a man of unclean lips. So what did the seraphim do? He takes a coal from the altar and he comes and he touches him on the lips and symbolizes the cleansing of that sin in his life. We all have to come to a point of recognizing and grieving over the sin in our lives. We've got to stop pushing it away. Just as you can't push away real life grief over loss in your life, or it comes back and rears its ugly head, if you don't grieve over the sin in your life and take care of that and be humble before God according to that sin in your life, then you are going to have it rear its ugly head in your life. Blessed are those who are willing to do so. Blessed are those who are willing to understand that it's through their own strength they are not able to purify themselves. Paul was such a man. Paul understood, if you read in Romans chapter 7, Paul says, "Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" Wretched man that I am. That was Romans 7:24. Is that where it was? Yes, Romans 7:24. Wretched man that I am, who can save me from this? Paul recognized that following the law was not going to do it. And we know Paul's background, we know his circumstances, being a Pharisee, being a zealot, being perfect in the law, being one who grew up knowing it, knowing all the right ways to legalistically live for the Pharisaical life. He knew what to do. He knew how to live it. He could quote it to you. But he understood his own efforts through his own practice of the law was not going to be enough to purify him. We have to realize that. Not only are we to recognize our own individual level of sin and despair and so forth that we need to grieve, there also has to be a cultural mourning in our lives. We should be a true realist. What's a realist? Kevin says it often. He'll say, I'm not an alarmist, I'm a realist. What is a realist? Okay? That's right. You see, if you're a realist, you see things for how they really are. You're not sugarcoating it. You don't look at it through blinders. You often can have a cynical view of life if you go too far with it, because you see life for what it really is. But as a Christian, we ought to be a true realist when we think about our culture. We ought to be a true realist as we think about those who are dying in their sin around us. We must understand that death is there and it must be faced. Recently, some of y'all saw it. I put an article on Facebook about things that I forbid to be said at my funeral. It was someone else's article and I put it up there. Some of y'all read it. Some of you made comments. One comment was made that they didn't agree with the article. And that the article was that they didn't. If saying these things helps comfort people, then we should. It's okay. I will come back and haunt anyone who claims that heaven received another angel when I die.
I'm going to have a top 10 list. I'm sorry, honey, if you beat me. I'm not making a Keenan's top 10 list.
Would you post that at the door so that someone that did not read the article?
Yeah.
Know?
Keenan's top 10 list of things not to say at his funeral.
Please do not say that.
Do not. Don't tell me I look good. I'm dead. All right, I'm dead. I look like a corpse. You know, if I look good then, what was the real life like? That's Yeah. So, but heaven does not receive another angel. There's even a Christian song out that talks about 33 Miles sings it, and so does Brad Paisley in country music. I heard it the other day, and it just really hit me for the first time. They said, when I get where I'm going to spread my wings and fly. You don't have wings now. Why are you going to have wings then? Anyway, I digress. But the question was, if these things bring comfort, shouldn't it be okay to say them? And my answer to that is no. Because at a funeral, during the time of someone's death, people are more aware and keenly in tune to the fact that death is real. And they need truth at that point. And the truth is comforting. Jesus died to take our place. If that person, if we don't know whether or not that person was a believer in Christ or not, we are not going to stress that he was a good person, because none are good, no, not one, and we're not going to preach them into heaven, because that gives a false comfort that will fall apart eventually.
That was my biggest issue when my dad died. My dad was a good man. I mean, I love my dad, but I knew my dad's issues and what he has done for most of his life, and everything that they were saying, they were preaching him into heaven. I was like,
Yeah, don't
so
preach.
sure.
Don't preach them into heaven.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I think that it unsettled me because I didn't know where he was going to be.
Yeah.
So what are you supposed to say?
The-
Here's some good advice here, because I'm always awkward in a funeral.
You can.
I told one woman I almost died getting here.
Oh.
I really did.
I told a friend of mine that plays the piano, I wanted him to play the Pop Goes the Weasel song, play it and stop and stare at the casket for a few
Oh,
seconds.
wow. I would focus on the fact that you're praying for them. The fact that you can be sorry for their loss. You can, those sort of things.
What about they're in a better place?
If you know that person, if you know their life, the old saying is, live your life in a way that the preacher doesn't have to lie at your funeral. If they've lived their life in a way that the preacher doesn't have to lie, absolutely they're in a better place. Absolutely, if you know.
won't haunt me if I come say that.
No, I won't haunt you if you say that. And if you know they're a follower of Christ because their life, the fruit of their life has revealed that, it's okay to say things like, well, they're in a better place. They're not really, I'm sorry that they're, for your grief, but they're not lost. We know where they are. You can't lose something when you know where it is. But some of the platitudes and some of the easy speakisms, we could say, that makes it so easy, because honestly, it makes us feel better to say it because it is awkward. And it's just easy to throw a platitude out there and be like, I'm done. I said it. Haven't got another angel. Okay. Anyway, Pam, you got your hand up?
Do you think sometimes it's maybe not necessarily Christians, but yet people know about God?
Very often. Very often, it's not Christians who are saying those things. But Christians do, you're right.
But they don't want to say they don't know God, so how can they
That's right.
say God?
So let's say if it's somebody who doesn't know God, I won't come back and haunt them. If it's one of you, I'm coming back to haunt you. Okay? Because you know better. Okay? So our mourning not only, we have to face the reality that death is real and must be faced. We have to face the real reality that God is there and God will be known as either Savior or Judge. Remember, we're talking about mourning. We're talking about grieving over sin. We're talking about the people, especially right now, the culture, the people around us who don't live their life this way. It should grieve our hearts to see people living in sin. That doesn't mean we voicefully condemn them for their sin. Don't hear that. What it means is it should drive us to what we would do in a grief situation. We should pray for them. We should we should live our life in a way that they see Jesus in us so that they can be moved away from that. Sin is real, and it is unmistakably black and ugly in the light of God's purity. Another thing we need to be real about is eternity is there, and everyone is rushing toward it. And finally, God's revelation is there, and it offers us alternatives. Always only two. Death or life. Pardon or condemnation. Heaven or hell. The lights are either on or they're off. There is no in-between state. There is no purgatory to be prayed out of. There is no second chance. That was what purgatory offers. There is no second chance to get it right and to help them once they have passed on. We need to be a realist and recognize these things. And being so will bring it to our forefront and help us grieve over that. But listen, we should mourn our own sin. We should mourn that of our culture. And we should also mourn things like the sins of our nation. The erosion of the concept of truth. Idea of absolute truth these days is far from what it once was. God has designed our nature, our world, in a way that lends us to see there are absolutes. I'm a math guy. The reason I love math is because there is an answer. Now, in some upper levels of math, you find out that your answer is there is no answer. But you've worked the problem to find that. Even in some algebraic expressions and so forth, there's a possibility of 2 or 3 answers. But there are answers that come from the problem. 2 plus 2, folks, is always 4. It's absolute. What goes up will come down. This is the law of gravity. Ask Mark. Ask him how he likes engine failure as he's flying, and he'll tell you he doesn't like it much. Okay, if you doubt whether or not gravity is more than a good idea, but the law, step off a building. That'll give you a real quick answer, right? God has designed our lives in the world around us to show us a glimpse of the fact that there are absolute truths. But in the culture we live in, we need to mourn the fact that the concept of truth is being eroded. We need to mourn the greed and cynicism in our world. And we need to also mourn for the lack of mourners. The amount of believers that don't have a problem with sin. The amount of believers who claim to follow the name of Christ and will go with culture's definition of what is right and wrong rather than what is God's definition. When you call up someone good, as we talked about earlier, you are using your standards. And your standards can get you in trouble. All of that can leave a very gloomy feeling. The first beatitude, walking right into the beginning of the second beatitude, and you really get into the depth of it, can leave you feeling like there's, despair. It leave you in a cloud. But we can't stop there, because the end of the second beatitude says, they shall be comforted. There is good news. We don't remain in our mourning. We are comforted by the knowledge that Jesus has provided the remedy for our sin. And if they will accept it, the sin of the world. We are comforted by what we just finished studying for 10 months through the book of Revelation, that the consummation of the age will come and all things will be redeemed. In this very book that we're studying right now, Jesus, we find out about him in the first chapter. In verse 21, it says, she will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus. Why? For he will save his people from their sins. He is the comfort. We find out again in Mark chapter 10, verse 45. It says, for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and what? To give his life as a ransom for many. You want to inherit the kingdom of heaven? First, you humble yourself before God and you admit to Him He's right and you're wrong. You grieve and you mourn over the sin in your life in that process. And through that, He will comfort you. And the comfort comes straight through the blood of Christ. And with that, we finish before noon. So, any thoughts or comments before we move on? And I hope you're all okay. It's a little different than what I had thought we would do, but the next couple of weeks we'll finish up the Beatitudes, and hopefully we're going to get into them a little deeper than we once did. I mean, I remember hearing them all my life, but I've never looked at them real close. And Jesus started this famous sermon using them, so they mean something more than what we often look at them to be. Any thoughts, comments? Y'all good? Thank you all for joining us on Facebook. We will see you next week.